My backlog is huge. Years and years of games I've bought, played for a little bit, then dropped for one reason or another. My last backlog video did pretty well, and I spent over a year tackling the most mid games on the planet. At least that's how the comment section put it. Well, guess what? I'm continuing that journey this year, tackling games one by one, even the most mid slop you can possibly imagine. I've already had a pretty successful start. In the past 3 months, I've completed 10 games that are both old and new. So without further ado, let's get started, shall we? I started out 2026 in the mood for a looter shooter. I know, what a surprise if you've been watching this channel for a while now. You know, that's kind of my thing. The looter shooter genre, however, at this point is kind of bare bones. There's really no fresh blood anymore, and the games that already exist are good enough, I guess. But either way, I decided to go back in time a little bit. So the first game I ended up playing was The Division 1. I had bought this game way back when it first released, and I remember actually liking it, but I never got around to finishing it. So it sat dormant in my backlog for what's basically a decade at this point, and that's exactly how lengthy backlogs get built. So what made me even want to go back to this game? Well, Ubisoft, like they always do, dropped a 60 FPS patch update for this generation of consoles, so it was a perfect time for a fresh start. I ended up spending a lot more time in the game than I had ever anticipated. Now, the story itself for The Division 1 was okay, and learning about the origins of the pandemic that basically wiped out millions was pretty interesting. The main thing that pulled me in was the amazing rendition of what is basically a post-apocalyptic New York City. I talked about it a lot in my reviews, so I won't rehash much of what I said, but it was an absolute treat to roam around in the big city. Nighttime was especially good. The mission designs were some of the best I've ever seen, and everything, even the most mundane rooms, were so finely detailed. The gameplay is your pretty standard cover-to-cover shooter, and there's a very solid loot game underneath it all. I finished the campaign and found myself deep in the end game, spending many hours rotating through all the activities available to me. What's interesting is that the game still has an active player base, and new people are still signing up as Division agents. So if you ever find yourself wanting to be in New York City, then there are others still around. I enjoyed my time with the Division quite a bit, and personally, I would rate it an 8 out of 10. I know what you're thinking, he's probably gonna play the Division 2 next. Well, you're kind of right, but you're also wrong, because the next game I completed in January was Avatar Frontiers of Pandora. We're 2 for 2 on the Ubisoft game so far. So what brought me back to this game despite it being out for a couple of years now? Well, the new third-person update drew me in. Damn it, Ubisoft, you got me again. Once I made it out of the very lengthy beginning, I was pretty much hooked. I think the game honestly has one of the most beautifully designed open worlds in modern gaming. Just roaming through on foot or high in the sky was a fun and unique experience. The game really surprised me in some ways. I especially enjoyed the hunting and gathering aspect of the game, which is something I don't normally interact with in games that offer similar mechanics. Combat was tight and fluid. I think the third person update helps a ton in creating a more free-flowing experience. I ended up finishing this game in about 23 hours or so, and that meant focusing mainly on the main story. There is a ton of side content to tackle that likely would have taken me well over 50 hours to push through if I went that route. Overall, it was a pretty solid experience and one that I would recommend. I ended up liking it more than I thought I would. This one gets a 7.5 out of 10. Alright, are we out of the Ubisoft woods yet? Yes, we are, but temporarily. The next game I tackled wasn't just a single game. No, I decided to tackle an entire franchise. The Darksiders franchise. Man, let me tell you, I've never had so many ups and downs while playing games in a single trilogy the way I did with this series. In January, I started with Darksiders 1. This was such a throwback to the PS3 era, which makes sense considering it was released for that, but one that I enjoyed thoroughly. Darksiders has always been a series that I've kind of overlooked. I remember buying the games after very steep discounts, but never even booting them up, kind of like what a lot of us do with the Steam sales. You buy a game because it's cheap, but it never gets installed. Anyway, Darksiders 1 has that old school PS2 era God of War mixed in with a little bit of Devil May Cry. I ended up really liking the story. It was far more involved than I had expected, and War was a pretty interesting character besides being one of the most stoic dudes on the planet. The combat itself was a high point for me. I likely didn't take full advantage of all the offerings as far as the movesets available goes, but I really had a fun time with it. Things did start to get a bit shaky for me, mostly in the game's mission design, where I would often have to go go and collect 4 objects or close 4 portals. This crippled the experience a bit because it did get repetitive as the game went on. And the puzzles in this game are genuinely difficult. I mean, they are some of the hardest I've had to solve in these types of games, but I might just have room temperature IQ. That being said, the overall experience was a fun playthrough. I'd give Darksiders 1 a 7.5 out of 10, mostly weighed down due to its mission design. Well, it only makes sense that I would move through the franchise sequentially, right? Wrong. I jumped ahead to Darksiders 3. Kidding. I'm kidding. The next game was Darksiders 2. And wow, I don't think I've been more impressed by a sequel this much. There is a huge jump in production quality going from the first game to the second game. Darksiders 2 opens up the world for you to freely travel through these huge regions. The landscape has this beautiful scale to it. The color palette is far more vibrant, moving away from the grays and browns of the first game. There is more depth to the combat system. There are more weapons to choose from. There's even a bit of build customization through the game's skill tree and loot system. I feel like you could just tell that the studio had a bigger budget for the second game and they went all in. Death is also a solid character as well, and the narrative ties very nicely to the first game, as does the third game, but we'll get that info soon enough. I don't know, I really ended up liking this game quite a lot, and it did end up being my favorite of the trilogy. This one gets an 8.5 out of 10 from me. We're still in the month of February where it is brutally cold where I'm from, which gave me all the more reason to stay home and play video games. Once the kids are asleep though. It was sad for me, however, that I spent the precious hour or two of gaming each night by playing Darksiders 3. I know, I'll catch some flack for this from the Darksiders fanbase, but that's fine. They already let it out in my trilogy playthrough video. Remember I said this series has a lot of ups and downs? Well, this is the down part. Darksiders 3 changes things up by following a Souls-like formula rather than the series' typical approach to gameplay. That means there's a currency you collect to level up by killing enemies, and the objective of this particular game is killing the 7 deadly sins, which are all these huge boss fights. The problem I had with this game was that it just wasn't good. The narrative was extremely weak, and yes, it takes place during the events of the first and second game concurrently, but Fury, who is the main character of this title, isn't really involved in the meta story. She's off on her own, attempting to do the bidding of the Charred Council. That's fine, but the game just feels so uninspired. The vibrant color palette of the second game is gone, replaced with more grays and browns. The combat mechanics feel more simple, there are less weapons to use, the level design is extremely weak, and overall the game just felt like 2 steps back. I don't know. I wasn't feeling this game at all, and personally, I would rate it a 5 out of 10. Well, that's the Darksiders trilogy. I'll soon be doing an entire video on the Darksiders franchise, which includes Darksiders Genesis, and I think I may have just broken a record for most times someone said Darksiders in 60 seconds. Anyway, remember when we left the Ubisoft realm? Well, we're getting pulled back into it. I started the year out by beating Division 1, so it was only right that I eventually got to Division 2. So here we are, late February and getting just one last game in. At this point, I sort of knew what to expect going in. A lot of the systems from the first game carry over to the second. There's a pretty fiery discussion amongst the Division fan base about which of the 2 games is better. Personally, after beating the Division 2 and also spending a substantial amount of time in the endgame, I found the sequel to be better in terms of gameplay, mechanics, and the build crafting system, but there are certain heights that the second game fails to reach in its environmental storytelling, level design, and overall feel that the first game sets such a high bar for. To add to that, the narrative in the second game is far weaker and honestly almost non-existent for the most part. The main story wraps up pretty quickly, and then you're pushed into the endgame loop. Of course, the support for Division 2 is still ongoing. Ubisoft continues to push more updates in the form of new seasons and new DLCs, and most recently they introduced a realism mode where enemies die in a single headshot. I think overall the Division 2 is a very good game. It scratches the looter shooter itch really well for me, and to be honest, right now I think it's the best looter shooter someone can play. Borderlands 4 was a bit of a disappointment in my eyes. Warframe feels like I need a PhD in order to understand it, and Destiny's population continues to dwindle. I would give Division 2 an 8 out of 10. It is finally March, and I promise you will never guess which games I tackled next, because honestly, they weren't even in my personal list to tackle. As my usual video planning routine goes, I scroll through my backlog and find an interesting game to make a video on. A certain game caught my attention, and I was wondering what it was even doing in my library. That game being Robocop Rogue City, Wait, what? Yeah, see, I bought this game on sale like a year ago, and I very vividly remember playing it for like 30 minutes and thinking, okay, this is pretty decent. I'll hop back on this tomorrow, only I never played it again. So it was finally time. Robocop Rogue City feels like such a throwback game, not just because of the game's setting, but the whole mechanics that it's built around just feels like an Xbox 360 era type game. You go around completing missions, solving crimes, and literally blasting everyone and everything in sight. There are a good amount of weapons to pick up and use, blasting doors open never gets old, and the vibe of the game was very unique from just about everything I've played so far in 2026. You might be wondering what even made me go down this route, but honestly, I needed a break from the longer and larger games, and Rogue City couldn't have been a more perfect avenue to go down. It was a quick 12-hour adventure, very little distractions, just main story focus with fun gameplay and a good challenge. I couldn't ask for anything more. I won't sit here and say it's an amazing game by far. It does have its pitfalls, mostly on the technical side, lackluster side quests, and the gameplay does in fact start to feel repetitive towards the end game. This one gets a 7 out of 10 from me. But wait, did you know that this game got a standalone expansion? Yeah, I didn't either until I was sitting on PSN scrolling around. Now, given the fact that I had been on a bit of a franchise completion streak, it was only right that I tackled the expansion as well. That meant I had to buy my first game of 2026, which was Robocop Unfinished Business. Thankfully, it was on a big sale. The game is very similar to Rogue City, which shouldn't come as a surprise. It's a separate story, however, and the bulk of it takes place in only one location, which is a bit of a letdown. I think the expansion isn't as good as the base game, but it does add some new weapons to the mix, like this insane cryo launcher thing, and some finishers, but that's pretty much it. I ended up platinuming these games because they were so short, and also because I may have lost my mind, but the video is still on this channel. However, it might not be here for too long. Anyway, Unfinished Business gets a 6 out of 10 from me. We're still in March, and it was time for me to tackle a big game. That's right, I'm talking about Starfield. Man, the comments section on that Starfield video is wild. Starfield is probably one of Bethesda's biggest letdowns, and that's saying something, but I genuinely enjoyed my time with the game for what it was. I had never played the game before, and it was just sitting there on my Game Pass pretty much untouched, so I figured, why not? The one thing that hooked me personally more than anything was that sense of exploration that the game presented me with. I love space games, and being able to just land on planets and walk around or jump from system to system and see everything that they have to offer is something that is really right up my alley. The main questline, of course, was a disappointment. It just felt so disjointed, but what I really ended up enjoying were the faction questlines. This is where the game shines bright, and the factions were the highlight of the game for me. Starfield is a large game, and it's hard to ever say that I completed it fully, but I likely won't be going back to it given my remaining backlog and all the videos I want to make. It's a solid game that I know caused a major stir amongst the Bethesda crowd. For me, however, I would give it an 8 out of 10. That brings me to what I'm currently playing and will likely be wrapping up very soon, Crimson Desert. It's rare for me to fall in love with the game as much as I did with this one, and the funny part is, I wasn't even hyped for it. I didn't follow the hype cycle. I genuinely did not care for it, but ended up buying it so I could make a video on it regardless. Imagine my surprise when I realized just how good it was. I'll be dropping a full video on this game really soon. Well, that's the first backlog update of the year. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you guys for watching as always, and I will see you all in the next one.